Welcome to EPG Pathashala. My name is Vidya-mitra. I am on the teaching faculty of the Department of Linguistics at Osmania University, Hyderabad. This is Introduction to Psychoneurolinguistics Course 10, Module 1. I will be talking about Introduction and History of Psycholinguistics. The main objective of this lecture is to give you some brief history to the field of psycholinguistics, how it evolved since mid-50s to the present period. I'll also draw your attention to some of the questions addressed by psycholinguistics in relation to language comprehension, language production and language acquisition. This lecture draws from the very first module which gives a brief history of how psycholinguistics developed from mid-70s up till recently. So it will also draw your attention to some of the questions addressed by psycholinguists in relation to language comprehension, language production and language acquisition. So the history primarily pertains to these three major components of psycholinguistics. The term psycholinguistics itself goes back to the year 1954. It was used in a title of a report called Psycholinguistics, a survey of theory and research problems. It was put together by a working group set up to study the relation between linguistics and psychology. This report was authored by Osgood and Seaborg, and it was later published as a book in 1965. So the word psycholinguistics was the title given to the report in 1954. So what is the scope of psycholinguistics, which is different from psychology of language, you might wonder. Psychology of language basically is focusing on mental processes like attention, memory, thinking, problem solving, much more than language itself. Psychologists look at the actual performance of speakers, either when they are producing sentences or they're listening or they're reading or writing. So psychologists are more interested in performance. As opposed to this, linguists are more focused on rule-based knowledge, linguistic knowledge about one's language, which is what Chomsky called competence. Psycholinguistic development can also be traced to how the different people, different disciplines interacted with linguistics and what their focus was at different linguistic levels. So, for instance, syntax, as you know, looks at the relation between signs and signs, and this was the focus of theoretical linguists. Semantics, on the other hand, looks at relation between signs and meaning, and philosophers paid more attention to semantics. Pragmatics is about relation between signs and people and their beliefs. Psychologists gave more importance to pragmatics. So this is how initially the different levels of linguistics was divided among the language related disciplines like psychology, philosophy and linguistics. However, psycholinguistics became much more interdisciplinary than just dealing with psychology and philosophy. Now there's a lot of interaction between computer scientists and cognitive science people, including neurologists, with linguists. As a result, psycholinguistics today is much more interdisciplinary. But in today's lecture, I will trace the developments in the field of psycholinguistics across three different time periods: 1955 to 1970s, 1970s to 1990s and 1990s to the present. So behaviorism does not account for anything that is not observable. It accounts for learning through experience that comes through senses. So there is no belief in the existence of mind. So the first period was marked with behaviorism, and this is what behaviorism is about. it focuses on actions and consequences of the organism. Behavior is the result of complex system of rewards and punishments. These are some key features of behaviorism. And so if you see on the screen how operant conditioning, Skinner explained about operant conditioning. He says basically that behavior is reinforced if there is positive reinforcement, that is presence of pleasant stimuli can result in increase of the behavior, or even absence of unpleasant stimuli also. So these are positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. As opposed to this, if suppose there is punishment, then the behavior decreases. If you observe the figure, there is a arrow pointing downwards, that whatever behavior it is decreased if there is punishment, but reinforcement can be both positive and negative. So you study this behavior. I mean, it's extremely concise description of behaviorism. You can go back to the e-text to read more about it. By 1959, there's a lot of critique was mounting against behaviorism, and of course, Chomsky's publication, he critiqued Skinner's book called Verbal Behavior in 1959. Chomsky critiqued Skinner's book, saying that not all normal children acquire comparable grammar with by the time they are 3 years old, if it is only based on rewards and punishment and input from the environment. For them to be so successful language learners, they must be having something innate, some innate capacity to learn and use language. So, of course, Chomsky then went on to write his own books focusing more on linguistic structures and innate ability. You can see Chomsky's picture on the screen. He was born in 1928 and he is very much alive. The major tenets of mentalism is that the speaker has in his or her possession a system of grammatical rules about his or her native language, which Chomsky called competence. Okay? And Chomsky also argued that it is only competence that can be studied systematically and not performance. So then you might wonder, how is it then psycholinguistics addressed performance? Alright? They had to engage with the linguistic theories of that time, and the initial years they were trying to test the psychological reality of a linguistic theory called transformational generative grammar or TG grammar. Okay? And the initial experiments that psychologists were involved was called Derivational theory of complexity or DTC, which is what you will be explained in the next slide. DTC, they argued, will explain our ability to comprehend meaning of utterances depending upon how many transformation each particular sentence that we hear. So, for instance, let's look at some examples. The first sentence says, the robot shoots the ghost. This is an active affirmative sentence and there are no transformations. It's a straightforward, the robot shoots the ghost. So, it is very easy to process, there are no transformations. Suppose you hear, the ghost is shot by the robot. This is a passive sentence, affirmative, and has one transformation, passive. So, it's a little more complex than the active affirmative. Third sentence, is the ghost not shot by the robot? This is passive, negative, and a question. There are three transformations. So, this is most complex. So, they tried doing experiments to show the more number of transformations that one has to engage in, the more difficult it is, and therefore the participants in the experiments will take much longer to process sentences like 3 as opposed to sentence like 1. Okay, but by about 50s, 60s, they were doing these experiments. DTC did not receive 100% support in the sense like some of the experiments failed to show support to this kind of logic. It was pointed out that transformations needed to be reversed only when there are insufficient semantic cues. The main point is that syntax, the earlier DTC was going only by syntactic explanation. How many transformations are there? That is, there is a deep structure, there is a surface structure. Between the two of them, we think about the deep structure and look at these transformations and then come up with the surface structure. So that is a syntax centric explanation. They are ignoring the semantic cues. So it was pointed out by mid-late 60s, a syntactically complex but semantically simple sentence might take less time than a syntactically simple but semantically complex utterance. Some computational models emerging around this time also raised objections to DTC's linear processing assumption that sentences involve more transformations take longer time was contested. So by 70s, language acquisition, in what way language acquisition was studied by psychologists as opposed to linguists? Because their perspectives are slightly different. Linguists are looking at competence, psychologists are looking at performance. So how was language acquisition studied by these two groups? A very well-known psycholinguist from our context, Ajit Mohanty, once commented, and I quote, "While the psychological studies sought to examine the environmental and contextual conditions of acquisition, mostly using cross-sectional methodology, with almost complete neglect of formal properties of language, linguistic studies of language acquisition used longitudinal studies, not cross-sectional. So they took one child and followed up that child. And they focused on acquisition of form and structure and neglected the function. Very little emphasis was given to psychological processes of perception, attention, memory. So linguists ignored the psychological processes, psychologists ignored the structural processes. That's how the initial studies in language acquisition went on. Then when we move on to the second phase of psycholinguistics, that is 1970s to 1990s, one can say that this phase is marked by considerable number of experiments in language comprehension. That is, in the history of psycholinguistics, comprehension was studied much more rigorously and more often than production for methodological problems, equipment and things like that, which you will understand later when we go into production area. So second phase was focusing on how do we understand the meaning of sentences, especially those in which there is some ambiguity. So in sentence comprehension module, you will learn more about this garden path effects and all that. So I will briefly talk about the very famous sentence called "the horse raced past the barn fell." This is supposed to be ambiguous because one is not sure whether it is the horse which fell or the barn which fell. So, but if you heard the sentence as "the horse which was raced past the barn fell," then it is much more clearer that it is the horse which fell. So one is unambiguous, second one, the first one is ambiguous. So the explanation given at that time in the 70s and 80s and all that is that there are some universal parsing strategies. There is a mental parser in our brain mind, and that parser, the moment the sentence falls on our ears, it starts parsing, and there are certain strategies. The two strategies that was proposed in this area was late closure, which says whenever possible attach material into the clause or the phrase which is under processing right now. Late closure. Minimal attachment is the other strategy. Attach incoming material into the phrase marker being constructed using as few nodes as possible in the syntactic tree. And of course, you have to obey the well-formedness strategies of the language in which you are doing this parsing. So I urge you to look at the audio file for module 8 for a detailed discussion about these strategies along with some visual material. You look at that module to learn more about it, and also the e-text. But very soon researchers began to say that you can't possibly have universal parsing strategies like late closure and minimal attachment, because these strategies do not work for languages which are structurally very different from English. So psychologists and computer scientists who were at that by 80s, 90s were dealing with interactive models of language processing as opposed to serial autonomous models, syntax and then semantics. Instead, they're saying there is simultaneous activation of information in the brain. There is distributed processing. So these interactive information processing models critique the modularity assumption underlying parsing strategies proposed by earlier psycholinguists. Basically, their point is that we don't process sentences in isolation. We always have some cue from the context. Context helps us disambiguate. So you can't talk about universal strategies. By the end of 1990s, researchers began to abandon the idea that language is a special module. That there is, remember I said that initially the Chomskyan competence is basically saying there is a special module, there is a universal grammar, all the rules about native language we already know. It's innately, and we are innately endowed with the capacity to learn and use language, right? But by the end of 1990s, this idea got shifted a little bit. So the second period is marked by active exploration of the connection between general cognition and language, right? And thirdly, this you might wonder what happened in the 1990s for this shift to occur. A whole lot of data was gathered from languages which are very different from English. So cross-linguistic research, multilingualism, embodied cognition through study of co-verbal gestures, all these developments contributed to the shift away from behaviorism, into cognitivism of the 1990s. And this also led to designing of many online methods of language. So then let's look little more closely at the third phase of 1990s to the present. What happens in psycholinguistics from 90s onwards? Let me first mention the main points, bulleted points which you will see on the screen. There has been more research on role of input and statistical properties of language in learning language. That is, people began to pay attention to not just how different structures emerge in child language, how often do children hear those structures in the input they receive from their mothers or other caregivers. So corpus studies began to come up. Electronic corpora they started designing by recording mothers and children playing together, or it doesn't have to be mother, any caregiver. So with that, there is a lot of input and statistical properties of language began to be investigated. Cross-language comparison of production, perception and development of language. Second and third language acquisition began to be studied instead of just native language. Neural correlates of linguistic representation and processes. Neurologists came into picture. They were trying to look at using neuroimaging techniques like PET, MRI, fMRI. They started looking at which brain areas get activated when you're listening, when you're reading, when you're speaking, when you're generating a verb in relation to a noun. Evidence from language disorders offered quite a bit of new information. Then there is this notion of embodied cognition, that language does not mean our knowledge about symbol system, grammatical rules. Our body plays a role in language. When I kick a ball, It's not that I know only K-I-C-K is kick, it is a verb. I also have the experience of having kicked the ball. That experience gets stored somewhere. My body is participating in language. So it's called embodied cognition. Okay. So these are the main areas of research from 1990s on. I will only touch upon just few examples out of these in this lecture. You can read the e-text for details of other points. Let's look at statistical properties. So once large corpora of naturally occurring language samples became available, researchers began to investigate whether language processing is influenced by relative frequency of different either linguistic categories like noun, verb, or constructions, say active, affirmative, active, negative. We have talked about those sentence types. Which sentence types are more frequent in a given language? So they started looking at statistical properties. Then you would have heard about Childs database, CHILDES. That is Child Language Data Exchange System. Is online, it's available. Researchers can take this, of course it is based on English speaking children, but you can access that corpora and you can do research into different aspects of child language acquisition. Cross-linguistic findings. The researchers began to realize notions like vowel harmony, ergative constructions, agglutinative morphology, all these behave differently in different languages. And therefore, language acquisition might be different depending upon that particular typology of language, characteristics of that language. Then in the area of second and third language learning, new methodologies have been designed since 1990s to look at a second language user, whether their first language is influenced the second language, or is it possible for their second language to influence even the first language. The concept of attention, working memory, automaticity of second language, fluency, all this were developed quite a bit. Lots of questionnaires were developed to assess proficiency and fluency in a language in bilinguals and multilinguals all over the world. More online techniques are also available during this period. Availability of functional magnetic resonance imaging, event-related brain potential data is being collected from bilinguals, and all this permitted evaluation of psycholinguistic models of bilingual word processing, and a new model called bilingual interactive activation, BIA plus model is now available. So then what are some of the recent debates in psycholinguistics in this last phase? So current phase is marked by abandonment of strict demarcation between syntax and semantics, a greater focus on variation in language structures and processes rather than language universals, promoting the idea that word learning is linked to changing sensory motor abilities of infants, role of body in influencing language use in people who routinely use more than one or two languages. So now this brings me to the conclusion of today's lecture. To summarize, this is the very first lecture in Psychoneurolinguistics. This is the first module, and I have talked about in this module history of psycholinguistics during the past about 50-60 years, from mid-50s onwards. 1955 to 1970 is the first phase, and it is marked by shift from behaviorism to mentalism. 1970 to 1990, the second phase was dominated by sentence comprehension experiments, but slowly the explanation for performance of people who are listening and understanding sentences changed from syntax-centric explanation to integration of syntax and semantics. And in the third and final phase of 1990s to the present, role of input, second and third languages, cross-linguistic studies, role of body in language was emphasized. To summarize the lecture, I started this lecture with giving you history of psycholinguistics from mid-50s to the present day. I've talked about this history in relation to three major periods, 1955 to 1970, marked by a shift from behaviorism to mentalism. And the second phase of 1970s to 1990 was dominated by research on sentence comprehension, and where towards the end of the period they also there's a shift from syntax centric explanations to integration of syntax and semantics in comprehending meaning of sentences. The third phase from 1990s to the present, a lot of research took place in relation to role of input in language acquisition, cross-cultural or cross-linguistic studies, which are very different from English. Then there is the role of body in language, embodiment, second language and third language learning. These are some of the issues which dominated the third period.